Hey there, viewers. Here's something to think about. If someone confessed a horrifying secret to you, would you stay silent or speak out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Last night, Diddy's own priest broke his silence, revealing what he heard during confession, and trust me, it's more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. A Visit in the Dead of Night. I still remember the way the church looked that evening. I had finished the last evening mass and lingered in the main hall longer than usual. The candles were burning low, their flames trembling as if they sensed something in the air. The pews creaked when I walked past them, and every little sound seemed amplified in the silence that followed the final hymn. My heart felt oddly heavy, like I was bracing for something I couldn't name. I remember running my fingers along the smooth wood of the pews and whispering a short prayer, asking for guidance. I never guessed just how much I would need that prayer by the end of the night. When I went to lock up the church doors, I saw a figure standing in the rear aisle. At first, I only made out the silhouette of a man, shoulders hunched, face hooded by the dimness. My immediate reaction was concern. Nobody was supposed to be in here at this hour. But before I could utter a word, he turned, and even from that distance I recognized him. It was Diddy. I had seen him a few times before, usually accompanied by a small entourage, showing up for special services or charity events, but that night he was alone. He moved with a strange stiffness, as though his body was fighting against him. There was an unfamiliar darkness around him, a sense that made the tiny hairs on my arms stand on end. I approached slowly, careful not to startle him. He looked up, and I could see that his eyes seemed different too. They glistened in the candlelight, but looked clouded, as though he carried a million burdens in them. I asked if he needed help, but he only shook his head and said in a low whisper, "I need confession." I knew then that this was no ordinary visit. There was urgency in his voice, a desperation that struck me to my core. The confessional was dark, and my heart thumped louder than I ever recalled. I sat on my side, waiting. The wooden walls felt closer than usual, and the small lattice window between us seemed almost suffocating. When he began to speak, I realized immediately that his voice was different. It had a deeper pitch, resonating with an odd tremor. Sometimes it sounded like him, but other times I could swear another voice overlapped his own. It wasn't just an echo. It was as if some unseen entity was trying to speak through him. He started off with a single sentence. "Some confessions do not bring peace." I remember gripping my rosary right then. My mother always told me that the rosary was a shield in the darkest moments, and that moment felt awfully dark. The air in the booth grew thick, almost solid, and I recall feeling a chill snake up my spine. I must have squeezed the rosary so hard that the beads pressed into my palm, leaving indentations. He took a long pause. I heard him breathing on the other side, ragged breaths that echoed in the stillness. I whispered, "Go on, my son," even though my instincts told me something terrible was about to unfold. There was a sense of dread that tightened my chest. I had heard confessions for years, stories of theft, violence, betrayal, but never once had I felt that kind of foreboding. He finally spoke, and what came out sent my thoughts spinning. He said he wasn't just here to unburden his soul. He was here to deliver a warning, a testimony of something darker than any sin he had ever committed. He told me not to interrupt until he was finished, because if I did, he might lose his nerve to speak. So I sat there in complete silence, listening to the flicker of candles, the drip of water in the distant hallways, and the tremor in his voice. He recounted the exact time he arrived at the church. He noted the shape of the moon, the flicker of the last candle near the altar, the chill in the pews. And then he told me something I would never forget. "I'm not sure it's me speaking to you, Father. I'm not sure it's me at all." My heart pounded at these words. The booth felt too small, too cramped, and for a moment, I considered bursting out into the open air to catch my breath, but I forced myself to remain still, to listen. He described the weight he felt upon entering, how each step closer to the confessional felt like wading through water. He claimed it was as though 1,000 eyes were watching from the shadows, corners of the church that should have been empty. He confessed that he had tried to leave twice before stepping into the booth, but something pulled him in, something that demanded he speak. I clenched my teeth, wanting to break my vow of silence and ask what he meant, but I remembered his warning. I waited, gripping the rosary so tightly my knuckles ached. Then he said, "I need you to hear everything, Father. What I'm about to share isn't just my sin. It's a wound that bleeds through the entire industry, through people in power, and maybe even through this very church." The last part made my stomach turn. I'd heard rumors throughout the years, whispers of corruption, hidden deals, even hush-hush talks of the church looking the other way for certain donors. But hearing it from him, spoken in that raspy, layered voice, made it feel real in a way I was never prepared to face. He took a shaky breath, and I heard the wood of the confessional creak as he shifted his weight. I was amazed at how he tried to maintain some composure, but I could sense fear lurking beneath his words. He said he knew that after this confession there would be no peace for him. He said he was sure the things he had done couldn't be forgiven with mere penance. Yet, he had to tell someone. He said I needed to know, because it might save a soul or two down the line, or at least reveal a truth that had been hidden for far too long. My heart thudded in my chest. I felt sweat forming on my brow, and I wiped it away with a shaky hand. My mouth had gone dry, and though I wanted to say something comforting or guiding, I stayed silent. The truth is, I was terrified. I realized in that moment, as the shadows seemed to press in around the booth, that nothing in seminary had prepared me for this. The supernatural weight of it all seemed to bow the very walls of the confession. Diddy ended that portion of his confession by saying, "What I'm about to tell you will stay with you forever, Father. But I have no choice. I need at least one man of God to hear my story and carry it with him." Then he grew silent, as if he needed to gather his courage for the next part. I found myself breathing heavily, like I had just run a mile. My pulse pounded in my ears. Part of me wished I could run out and pretend none of this had ever happened. Another part of me felt a deep duty, a responsibility to listen and bear witness, no matter the cost. I whispered a silent prayer, one that barely made sense in my own head. I asked God to grant me the strength to endure whatever was coming next. I asked for protection, for clarity, for some sign that I would get through this ordeal without losing my faith. When Diddy finally spoke again, his voice was still layered, that mechanical edge echoing behind his words. He said, "Father, I'm going to start at the beginning, but promise me, no matter how you feel, you won't stop listening." I agreed, though my voice came out as little more than a strained breath. I heard him exhale, and then he began. He told me about a pact, a blood contract that changed his life forever. He said it was the reason he'd come to me. Something about those words, blood contract, set off alarms in my mind. This was no ordinary confession of sin. This was a confrontation with forces I barely believed in, forces that lurked behind worldly success and fame. His story was about to unravel piece by piece, and I knew that once I heard it, there would be no going back. The confessional's wooden walls suddenly felt like a coffin. My hands trembled around the rosary, and I closed my eyes, bracing myself. The drip of water in the distance sounded louder, as though each drop marked a second of my sanity ticking away. I prepared to receive his words, whatever they might be, and hold them within me, no matter the burden. Looking back now, if I had known the full extent of what he would reveal, would I still have listened? Would I have run from that church, locked the doors, and prayed that he found someone else to tell his horror to? Perhaps. But in that moment, I felt anchored to my vow of providing solace to the penitent, of being the one who hears confession in God's place. Even if the confession is so dark, it leaves a permanent mark on my own soul. He cleared his throat once more, and for a fleeting second, I thought I heard a second voice clear its throat as well, echoing after him. Then he spoke the words that signaled we were crossing a threshold, stepping into territory neither of us would ever escape completely. "Father," he began, "this all started with a price for the throne." Chapter 2. The Blood Pact. I have often comforted people in confession, reminding them that no sin is beyond forgiveness if the heart is truly repentant. But that night, as I sat there clinging to my rosary, I wondered if those words could apply to what Diddy was about to share. He'd hinted at a blood contract, and my mind spun with questions. I had read about such things in old books, pacts with hidden forces, deals struck at crossroads. I never expected to hear such a story spill from the lips of a man so prominent. Yet here he was, trembling on the other side of the confessional wall. He began slowly, like a man recalling a nightmare. He described a time when he was younger, hungry for success, desperate to make a mark in the music industry. He said he'd been approached by powerful men. At first, they seemed like standard industry moguls. But as the conversations continued, they spoke in riddles. They told him that true fame came with a cost, that fortune always answered to a master. I could hear the fear in his voice as he relived that moment. He remembered the feeling of being watched, not just by these men, but by something unseen, hovering at the edges of that dimly lit room. I asked quietly if he could describe these individuals. He hesitated. He said he didn't remember their faces well. They wore expensive suits, but their eyes seemed cold, like they had no light behind them. It was their words he remembered more than anything. Promises of wealth, influence, and a place at the top. They told him, if you want to sit on the throne, you must pay the price. At the time, he thought it was just a metaphor, a way of saying you have to work harder than anyone else. Now he realized it was literal. He recounted how one night, after a particularly intense recording session, he was invited to a private penthouse in New York. He recalled the elevator ride. A strange hush, as though the air itself held its breath. The elevator doors opened onto a grand living room filled with a handful of people he recognized from the industry, along with others he'd never seen before. They were all smiling, sipping from crystal glasses that held dark ruby-colored liquid. He assumed it was wine at first. Now he wasn't so sure. They led him to a central table. On it rested a large, ornate knife, its blade reflecting the penthouse's soft lights. Diddy felt a pang of apprehension, but he told himself it was just a ceremonial gimmick, maybe an initiation into some secret but harmless club. As he approached, the men around him murmured in low voices. He couldn't make out their words, but the language sounded ancient, nothing like English. He admitted to me that at that point, something in his gut told him to leave, but his ambition was louder than his fear. They asked him, did he want the throne or not? Did he want to walk away and be forgotten, another failed artist left behind in the streets? Or did he want to grasp the power that was within arm's reach? He remembered swallowing hard, thinking of all his struggles, his dreams, how close he was to achieving what he had always wanted. Then, in a moment he would regret forever, he stepped forward. One of the men took the knife and drew a small cut on Diddy's palm. He winced from the sharp sting, watching as a bead of blood appeared. Then the man handed the knife to him. Diddy said he felt an immense pressure at that moment, like 1,000 unseen hands were pushing him to complete the ritual. Without fully understanding, he pressed the knife to his own skin again, letting a few more drops of blood fall onto a piece of parchment. The writing on that parchment was in a language he couldn't read. He told me he watched his own blood soak into the strange words, and for a second the letters glowed faintly, as if alive. Then the men began to chant. Diddy confessed that he nearly collapsed from a sudden wave of dizziness, as if the room spun around him. He said a part of him wanted to scream, to stop this madness. But something else, something that felt like an external force, kept him still. When the chanting ended, one of the men lifted the parchment, blew on it gently, and folded it away. Diddy's head felt light, and he said he heard a voice in his mind whisper, "From this night forward, your life is not your own." I asked him if he ever tried to break free from that agreement. He laughed, a bitter sound in the darkness of the confessional. He said he didn't even fully believe what had happened until his career took a sudden meteoric rise. Overnight, doors opened that had been locked before. Opportunities came knocking without him even trying. His songs topped charts, collaborations fell into his lap, and money flowed in rivers. He initially thought it was all his hard work paying off, but then the nightmares started. He told me about dreams where he'd be standing in a vast hall with mirrors lining every wall. In each mirror, he saw his reflection, except it was twisted. His face elongated, eyes darkened. A low growl surrounded him in this dream, and he'd wake up drenched in sweat. Other nights, he'd dream of himself signing documents with a pen dipped in blood, while faceless figures stood around him, chanting in that same language he'd heard at the penthouse. As his success grew, so did his unease. He said it felt like there was something riding on his back, whispering instructions, guiding his every decision. When a business deal went sour, that presence would lead him to a new path, a better deal, even bigger successes. It was a gift, but one that never let him rest. There was always a demand, a condition, a price to be paid. Then there were signs he couldn't ignore. Once, he found the corner of that blood-stained parchment in an unmarked envelope on his desk. He swore he had never taken it from the penthouse, yet there it was, a silent reminder of his oath. He realized then that he was being watched. The men in suits were not just men. He could feel it. Their presence weighed on him, especially in quiet moments, as if they had eyes on him from every angle. He paused in his confession, and I heard him breathing heavily. My hands were clammy, and I realized I too was trembling. I'd never believed in the literal idea of pacts with darkness. The church taught us about evil, about sin, about the devil's temptations, but a real, tangible contract? It felt like something out of a horror tale. Yet hearing Diddy speak, hearing the terror in his voice, I began to doubt my own skepticism. He told me that from the night of that penthouse ritual onward, he no longer felt alone. Something followed him. Sometimes it was the men in suits. Sometimes it was a whisper in his dreams. Sometimes it was a flicker in the mirror. But always it was there. And with each success he achieved, the sense of that presence grew, feeding on his fame. He concluded this portion of his confession by saying, "My success is not just mine, Father. It's tied to whatever I signed away in that penthouse. I've tried to bury it under money, parties, and headlines, but it won't let me go. The louder I scream, the tighter it holds." His voice cracked then, and I sensed tears. I fought back my own wave of emotion, unsure how to console him. What words of forgiveness could possibly address a deal made with something so dark? I could feel the weight of his despair. In that moment, he sounded more like a lost child than a music mogul. I whispered that God's mercy was vast, but deep down, I was unsure if we were dealing with something that required more than simple confession. I wondered if exorcism or some form of spiritual cleansing was needed. But the fear in his voice told me he was convinced there was no escape. He had bound himself to these forces, and they were not in the business of letting go. Before I could form a coherent response, he said he had more to share. He told me this was only the beginning, the surface of what lay beneath his public image. Then he mentioned a presence in his studio, something that guided his music. My heart sank further. I had a feeling this story was about to get even darker. There was a tremor in my chest, a voice telling me to run, to get away from this confessional, but I stayed. I told him I was listening and that he should continue. He thanked me in a hollow tone, as though gratitude was a foreign concept by now. As he prepared to describe the next horrifying layer of his life, I silently begged for strength. This was no ordinary confession, no daily sorrow I could simply absolve with a few Hail Marys. This was a confession drenched in supernatural undertones, and I was an unwilling witness to the darkest corners of a soul that might already be lost. Still, I had promised to listen, and so I did, bracing myself for whatever nightmare would come next. Chapter 3. The Shadow in the Studio. When he started talking about the studio, his tone changed. It was as though he was reliving a fever dream, full of half-remembered images and fleeting shadows. He said music had always been his passion, his driving force. But after the pact, he began to sense an external influence in every note he produced, every lyric he wrote. It started as a faint presence, barely noticeable in the back of his mind, urging him to push harder, to stay awake longer, to chase perfection with an obsession that bordered on insanity. He recalled the earliest incident. He was working late at night, trying to lay down a track that just wasn't clicking. He'd been at it for hours, the same beat looping over and over. Frustrated and exhausted, he almost gave up. Then he felt it. A chill that swept through the studio, making the hairs on his arms rise. The recording equipment flickered and the overhead lights dimmed. In that eerie moment, a whisper grazed his ear. He couldn't make out the words exactly, but it felt like a guiding hand urging him to continue. Almost in a trance, he found himself hitting the record button. He played the beat again, and this time, lyrics and melodies flowed from him effortlessly, as if he were a puppet under someone else's control. He finished an entire verse in one take, something he'd never done before. It was so fluid, so perfect, yet when he played it back later, he barely recognized his own voice. It sounded deeper, layered. There was an undertone, a faint echo beneath his vocals. He tried to chalk it up to studio reverb or some sound effect accidentally left on, but no matter how many times he checked the settings, everything was normal. That was the first real sign that something was in there with him. Over time, the presence in the studio became more obvious. Doors would open and close on their own. Sometimes the temperature would drop so sharply he could see his breath fog the air, even though the air conditioning was off. On a few occasions, he'd find the track fully mixed and mastered by the next morning, even though he remembered leaving it unfinished. At first, he thought maybe one of his engineers had come in overnight, but each of them swore they hadn't touched it. The sense of unease grew heavier with every incident. Then came the blackouts. He spoke of entire nights he couldn't remember. He'd go in to record around midnight, and the next thing he knew, he'd be slumped in a chair at dawn, headphones askew, droplets of sweat on his face. He'd wake up disoriented, the track playing through the speakers fully laid out with layers of vocals, ad-libs, and harmonies he had no recollection of creating. People would congratulate him on his productivity, but deep down he knew something else was at work. He described the figure he saw one night, how it was just a dark silhouette perched in the producer's chair. He noticed it from the corner of his eye, and when he turned fully, the figure was gone. But the chair was still slowly spinning, as if someone had just stood up from it. That moment left him breathless. He told me he nearly sprinted from the studio in terror, but the same strange force that had kept him locked into the pact seemed to hold him there, compelling him to keep going. I listened in stunned silence. I thought about all the stories people tell of haunted places, demonic influences, and poltergeists. It was the kind of thing I'd always taken with a grain of salt, believing that God's love was stronger than any darkness. Yet hearing the tremor in his voice, recalling the unnatural echo in his tone, I felt my certainty waver. This was no campfire tale. This was a man, a living, breathing soul, ensnared by something beyond my understanding. He said his sleepless nights grew more frequent. He described pouring pot after pot of coffee, trying to keep himself alert as if that would help him stave off the entity's influence. It never worked. The moment exhaustion took hold, he'd drift off and wake up to find new tracks on his computer. Sometimes the words scrawled in the lyrics file were in that same unknown language he'd heard during the blood pact. He tried translating bits of it online, but it matched no existing language. It only added to his mounting sense of fear. Stranger yet, as the songs found massive commercial success, he began feeling a distorted pride. Part of him was thrilled at the recognition and the money, And that part, he suspected, was exactly what the entity fed on. Every time he basked in the glow of success, the presence felt stronger, as though he were fortifying it with his own ego. He confessed to me that he hated himself for it, but he couldn't stop. Fame was an addiction all its own. I felt a dreadful sympathy for him. I remembered him on television, smiling confidently, wearing expensive suits and speaking about hustle and ambition. The world saw a driven, charismatic entrepreneur. Now, hearing his voice shake in the confessional, I realized how much of that public persona was a mask to hide a deeper torment. He was trapped, and the studio had become both his sanctuary and his prison. He said he tried to bring in trusted friends to see if they could sense it too, but nothing happened when they were around. The entity seemed to vanish, or maybe it hid deeper in the shadows. His friends heard the final tracks and praised his genius, attributing his long nights to good old-fashioned hard work. If he tried to explain the feeling that something else was guiding his hand, they'd laugh it off, telling him he just had an angel on his shoulder, or that he was in the zone. But the presence he felt was anything but angelic. He recalled one particular night, the one that truly shook him. He was alone in the studio, playing back a rough mix of a new track. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. In that split second, he saw a face reflected on the dark screen of the monitor. Eyes gleaming with malice, mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong to any human. Diddy swore he felt the brush of cold fingers against his neck, his head, his heart beating within his jaw, his mouth tasting of. He dropped to his knees, choking on terror. When the lights came back on, everything looked normal, but the memory of that face lingered. He said he nearly vomited from the fear and revulsion. At this point, I could feel my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. The idea of an unholy force physically manifesting in his studio was horrifying. I found myself silently praying, asking God to shield me from this darkness. Even as I listened, part of me doubted, could this really happen? Was he exaggerating under the weight of guilt and stress? But then I remembered the faint layering in his voice, the unnatural chill that came over me when he spoke. Something told me he was telling the truth. He explained that eventually he started leaving the lights on bright, playing gospel music at low volume in the background, hoping to repel the presence. For a while it seemed to help. The oppressive feeling eased. He found that he could work without blacking out, but after a few weeks the presence returned with a vengeance. It began invading his dreams again, taunting him, showing him images of his worst fears, failure, poverty, betrayal. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing that low whisper telling him, "This is not over." He paused in his confession for what felt like an eternity, letting the silence hang between us. I thought about all the times I'd heard people joke about selling their soul for success. Now those jokes felt painfully real, like a cruel truth hidden in plain sight. He said he wanted to stop making music, to just walk away and find some peace. But each time he tried, the nightmares worsened. The entity would creep into his mind, reminding him of the pact, reminding him of the price he had yet to fully pay. Then he made a solemn admission that chilled my blood. He said, "Father, the truth is, I don't make my music alone. Something helps me. Something that's always there." He went quiet, and I heard a soft sob. In that moment, he sounded more broken than I had ever heard any man before. He was torn between the success that defined him and the dark force that made it possible. I tried to find words to comfort him, but nothing came. The usual platitudes about God's mercy felt hollow in the face of this supernatural oppression. He told me he had more to confess, and that this was only the beginning. There were deeper, more disturbing things he had witnessed, things that went beyond just a haunted studio. He mentioned the parties, those freak-offs, in a hushed, trembling voice, hinting at rituals and happenings that would make the blood pact sound almost tame. I braced myself, uncertain if I could handle hearing it, but knowing I had to try. Before moving on, he asked me if I believed him. I told him I did, though the words tasted foreign on my tongue. In truth, a part of me still clung to logic, to skepticism, to a desire to find some rational explanation. But the other part of me, the part that felt the chill, that heard the echo in his voice, knew that the darkness he spoke of was as real as the rosary in my hand. And so I prayed silently again, steeling myself for what he would reveal next. Chapter 4. The freak-offs were never just parties. He hesitated before starting this chapter of his confession. I sensed his reluctance, the weight of it pressed into the silence between us. When he finally spoke, his words were soft, almost broken, as though he was ashamed to even bring them to light. He said that the so-called freak-offs had become legendary in certain circles, a rumor to outsiders, but to those inside the industry, they were an open secret. Partygoers boasted about the debauchery, the endless flow of alcohol, the beautiful people dancing in every room, but Diddy confessed it was all a facade for something far more orchestrated, far more sinister. He recounted the first time he attended one. It took place in a sprawling mansion, the sort of lavish estate that boasted marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and rooms large enough to fit an entire concert audience. On the surface, it looked like a wild party, a crush of celebrities, models, high-profile producers, and assorted hangers-on. The music thundered, the lights dazzled. He described it as a carnival of excess. Yet, beneath that shiny veneer, there was a precise choreography unfolding. He told me about certain hallways that were roped off, guarded by stern-faced men in suits. Only a select few were allowed beyond. If you had an invitation, if you were deemed useful or important enough to the system, you'd be guided into these private rooms. Diddy followed at the beckoning of one of the high-level organizers, an older man with an unsettling grin who placed a hand on Diddy's shoulder and steered him down a dimly lit corridor. Once inside one of those exclusive rooms, the atmosphere changed drastically. The music was quieter, replaced by a pulsing undercurrent of whispered conversations and hushed laughter. He saw men and women, some he recognized, some he didn't, engaging in acts he could barely describe. Opulence dripped from every surface, plush couches, expensive rugs, the air thick with incense. But there was a darker undertone. You could sense it in the way people watched each other, the silent power plays happening in the corners. This was not just hedonism, it was ritual. He talked about how certain participants wore masks, not masquerade masks, but intricate designs that looked almost cult-like. They circled each other in bizarre, choreographed dances. Diddy noticed strange symbols on the walls, faintly glowing under black light. He said they looked like sigils, ancient emblems that made his skin crawl. The older man guided him through the crowd until they reached a table set with various implements, candles, chalices, even a small dagger. Diddy felt that same suffocating weight he'd experienced in the penthouse. It was as if something supernatural permeated the air. He spoke in a hushed, shaky voice about the oaths he heard whispered around him. People recited lines about loyalty to the system, about keeping their secrets hidden. He saw men in suits instructing younger, fresh-faced newcomers, telling them they were about to be inducted into a world of limitless power. Diddy recognized the same pattern of enticement he had once been lured by. Promise them greatness, make them swear loyalty, and bind them through acts that left them compromised or blackmailed. He described seeing a woman, barely out of her teens, led into a corner by two men. He could tell by her trembling that she didn't want to be there. As she vanished into the shadows, he heard faint sobs. No one intervened. Instead, the others in the room seemed to avert their gaze or pretend it wasn't happening. Diddy felt a sickness in his stomach. He wanted to step forward, to do something, but someone gripped his arm. The older man shook his head, smiling that unsettling grin, as if to warn him. This is how things are done. Interfere, and you risk losing everything. He recalled how the party escalated as the night wore on. More private rooms were opened, each tailored to a different kind of indulgence. Drugs were passed around like candy. People engaged in acts of dominance, some willingly, others less so. The event pulsed with an undercurrent of control, a demonstration of who held power and who obeyed. Diddy watched, horrified, as one young man tried to resist, shouting that he didn't sign up for this. He was swiftly overpowered, dragged off by 2 bouncers, never to be seen again that night. Later, Diddy realized he never saw that man in the industry again at all. It was as though he had been erased. At this point in his confession, Diddy paused. I asked if these parties were always like that. He took a moment, then replied that while not every party started so intensely, they always had layers. Public debauchery up front, deeper horrors in the back. He admitted he too had participated in some of the more extreme rooms, coaxed by peers, fueled by drugs, the atmosphere, and the unrelenting whisper of that presence he felt since the pact. He couldn't deny the part of him that was drawn to the power on display, even as it repulsed him. He then told me something that made my stomach twist. He said these gatherings weren't random. They were organized with almost military precision. The guest lists were curated to include people who were either complicit or who could be compromised. Cameras, hidden or otherwise, captured everything. Later, those tapes could be used as leverage against anyone who dared to step out of line. He recalled hearing about entire vaults of incriminating footage kept by certain industry elites, footage that ensured silence and obedience. If you ever thought about exposing the truth, well, they had a tape that could ruin your life. One of the nights, he witnessed what he could only describe as a ritual sacrifice. He said he didn't see the act itself, he couldn't bring himself to watch, but he heard the screams from another room, followed by silence. Then the older man returned, his expensive suit flecked with dark stains, calmly wiping his hands as though nothing unusual had happened. Diddy told me he almost broke down right there. The older man looked at him and said, "This is the price of the throne, boy. Don't forget it." Diddy felt a crushing despair, realizing that he was in too deep, tied by blood and secrets. I listened, my rosary pressed so hard against my palm that it hurt. I wanted to cry out in anger, in horror, but I kept silent. Was this truly happening, or was I being fed a nightmare spun from guilt and paranoia? But the rawness in his voice, the tremble when he spoke of that young woman's sobs, made it impossible to dismiss. This was too specific, too vivid to be pure fabrication. He confessed he had brought people to these parties himself, encouraging them to loosen up and have fun, only to realize he was leading them into a den of predators. Looking back, he saw how complicit he had become. Each time he partook, each time he turned a blind eye, he was reinforcing the system that had enslaved him. He said he hated himself for it, but fear and ambition had controlled him far more than compassion ever did. And then he told me about the aftermath, how he'd see someone's star rising in the industry right after they attended a freak-off for the first time. He realized it was the same cycle: entice them, initiate them, watch them flourish, then own them. Those who refused to comply disappeared from the scene or found their reputations mysteriously ruined. Some even died under suspicious circumstances. A car accident here, a sudden overdose there. He could see the pattern, but he felt powerless to stop it. By the time he finished describing the scale of these parties, my mind reeled. I'd spent my life in the church dealing with human sin, but not like this. This was orchestrated evil, a network of powerful individuals using rituals and fear to manipulate entire industries. It was the sort of darkness I'd only read about in ancient texts, yet here it was, described in painstaking detail by a man living in the heart of it. He went silent for a long moment, catching his breath. Finally, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Father. Sorry for being part of this, but you need to know. People think these are just rumors, just tabloid fodder. They have no idea." His voice cracked, and I felt my own heart breaking. I didn't know how to respond. What absolution could I offer for crimes woven into such a monstrous web? Still, I managed to remind him of God's grace, though my voice trembled with uncertainty. He responded with a hollow laugh. "God's grace, Father? I've seen men and women of God at these events too. I've seen them turn the other way because they're on the payroll or they love the power. My stomach churned. It was a direct jab at the integrity of the church I served. Yet, I couldn't deny the possibility. Power corrupts, and that corruption can reach anywhere, perhaps even into the sanctuary. He said there was more, that I needed to understand how deep it went. He was about to tell me how certain religious figures protected him, ensuring he stayed untouchable. I braced myself, feeling a knot form in my chest. Could it be that my own institution was complicit? The thought made me feel ill. I gripped the rosary, praying for strength, for discernment, for some way to handle what was coming next. Chapter 5. The Church's Role in the Cover-Up. I felt a tremor in my very core as he started this chapter of his confession. It was the part I dreaded the most, the role of the church, the institution I had given my life to. My faith was the anchor that kept me grounded, but as he spoke, I felt that anchor slipping. He recounted how, in the midst of all the chaos and dark rituals, he'd still occasionally appear in church, at charity events for photo ops, or even just to sit in the pews. Most people saw it as him staying connected to his faith or burnishing his public image, but Diddy said it served a deeper purpose. He spoke of certain clergy who approached him, men in vestments who assured him that as long as he gave to the right places, he would find absolution. At first, he believed them. He donated large sums to various church projects, funded youth programs, renovated aging cathedrals. To the public, it looked like generosity. Behind closed doors, these same clergy would thank him with a sly wink, implying that his sins would remain between him and God, or, more accurately, between him, God, and the men who benefited from his checkbook. He recalled one conversation with a high-ranking bishop. It took place in a private study, adorned with crucifixes and portraits of saints. The bishop thanked him for his substantial donation, then told him not to worry too much about certain rumors. Diddy remembered the bishop saying, "We all struggle with demons, son, but the Lord's work must continue, and you are helping it flourish." The words felt like a twisted absolution, a pass for moral indiscretions as long as the money kept flowing. I gripped the rosary so hard I thought it might snap. The idea of someone using the sacred trust of the church as a shield for atrocities sickened me. Yet, I couldn't entirely dismiss his claims. The church is a divine institution but run by flawed humans. History holds too many examples of corruption creeping in. I wanted to scream that this bishop was an outlier, not representative of the faith as a whole, but I remained silent, listening, forced to confront the fact that evil can wear any garb, even a clerical collar. Diddy then described how, after the freak-offs or other dark encounters, he'd sometimes feel the urge to confess, but each time he tried to find a priest who would truly listen and guide him, he was intercepted. A phone call from a higher-up would redirect him to a specific priest, one who would gloss over his sins, offer a few mild penances, and assure him of God's forgiveness. It never felt real to him. It felt staged, as though these priests were more concerned with preserving a benefactor than saving a soul. He recounted a time when he tried to confess to a local parish priest, someone he believed was unconnected to the higher echelons, but the next day one of the men in suits showed up at his house, warning him, "That's not the right confessor for you." The threat was clear. They had eyes everywhere. He was not free to choose the path of genuine repentance without consequences. I asked him if he ever confronted these church leaders, if he ever asked them how they justified protecting him despite knowing the unspeakable things he'd done. He let out a bitter laugh. He said one of them told him, "We all have skeletons, and your confessions help the church know where it needs to direct its prayers." The notion was twisted, as if his revelations were simply intelligence to keep him under watch. He felt used, manipulated, just another pawn in a system bigger than he could fathom. At this point, my mind whirled. I'd spent my life believing in the sanctity of confession, the idea that it was a refuge for sinners seeking grace. To hear it twisted into a tool for cover-ups shattered my heart. But I also realized that wherever there is power, there is potential for corruption. Diddy was describing an unholy alliance of church figures and industry titans, each benefiting in their own way. Money for the church, absolution for the sinners, and protection for them all. He said this went beyond just hush money. Some religious figures actively participated in the so-called events, though they kept a lower profile. They'd bless the gatherings or turn a blind eye to the more extreme activities. I felt nauseous. A clergyman's role is to safeguard souls, to lead people away from darkness. Yet he was telling me of priests offering blessings to the very rituals that enslaved these individuals to evil. It was an abomination of everything I held sacred. He confessed that each time he handed over a donation check, he felt a stab of guilt. But he also felt relief, thinking maybe this would keep the higher-ups off his back for a while longer. Maybe it would buy him some reprieve from the nightmares. It never did. The nightmares continued. The presence in his studio persisted, and the demands from his handlers grew. But the church served as a veneer of respectability, a shield against too much public scrutiny. After all, how could a man who generously supports religious causes be involved in something so terrible? I asked him why he chose to come to me this time. Why not one of the priests who would just wave away his sins? He said he was tired of living a lie, tired of not being heard. He admitted he was scared too, because some of his associates had dropped ominous hints that his usefulness was nearing its end. He needed a real confessor, someone who wasn't in on the scheme, someone who would listen without an agenda. My throat felt tight as I realized the danger I might be in just by hearing him out. He went on to describe how the church's involvement went far beyond him. It was part of a larger network of influence, where powerful donors and officials exchanged favors. The moral code was bent, twisted to accommodate the wealthy and powerful. He said it seemed some believed that as long as the church received enough funding, the outward show of piety was all that mattered. Their justification might have been that these donations ultimately did good in the world, building schools, hospitals, feeding the poor, but the cost was immeasurable, paid in human souls and suffering. I felt a surge of anger, not just at the individuals involved, but at the darkness that had crept into corners of the church I loved. I could barely keep my voice steady as I asked if he believed any good priests remained. He hesitated, then said, "I believe there are good ones. I'm hoping you're one of them." His words weighed on me like a mantle of responsibility. I wanted to assure him I was, but I was just a man, and in that moment, I felt very small, overshadowed by forces that seemed too vast to confront. Diddy told me that the reason he was spilling all these details now was because he sensed his time was running out. He had wanted to speak to a priest who wasn't on the payroll, who might actually care about saving his soul. He also felt a need to warn others, though he doubted many would listen. "Power has always been above morality," he said. "I learned that the hard way." His voice dripped with regret. He knew there was a moral line he had crossed long ago, and he couldn't see a way back. I asked him if he still had hope. He paused, let out a long sigh, and said, "I don't know, Father. That's why I'm here. Maybe I'm looking for it, or maybe I just want someone else to know the truth." My heart ached at the bleakness in his tone. I realized that while he sought confession, he might also be giving me a burden, one that could place my life at risk if what he said about these networks of power was true. He concluded this chapter of his confession with a chilling statement. "I used to think the church was the one place I could find salvation. Now I'm not so sure. I've seen behind the curtain, and it's not what I thought it would be." I wanted to protest, to tell him that not all clergy were corrupt, that not all corners of the church were dark, but I remained silent, unsure how to reassure him or myself. The confessional walls felt closer, the air heavier. I silently prayed for guidance, for the words to say, but nothing came. I was left staring into the darkness, listening to the ragged sound of Diddy's breathing, feeling the weight of a centuries-old institution pressing down on me. In that moment, I understood that hearing a confession like this could change my life forever, and something told me the worst was yet to come. Chapter 6. The Missing and the Silenced. He inhaled sharply, as if preparing himself for the next plunge into the darkness of his memories. When he spoke, his voice was low, carrying the weight of secrets that had haunted him for years. He said, "Father, there are people who knew too much. They tried to speak out. Now they're gone." I felt a chill settle on my skin. It was one thing to hear about parties and rituals, but the prospect of disappearances and silenced whistleblowers took this to a whole new level. Diddy began listing names, some I recognized from tabloids, others completely unfamiliar. Musicians, producers, managers, assistants. People who had either vanished without a trace or died under suspicious circumstances. He recounted the story of one young artist who publicly announced he had evidence that would shake the industry to its core. Weeks later, he was found dead in his apartment, the official cause listed as an overdose. But Diddy had his doubts. He'd heard from a mutual friend that the man never touched drugs. He mentioned a business partner who once confided in him about having a secret stash of recordings, conversations where powerful men openly discussed their manipulations, their blackmail tactics, their ties to the occult. This partner had planned to expose them, believing the truth would set him free. One night, after leaving a studio session, he got into a black SUV with tinted windows. That was the last time anyone saw him. The official story was that he fled the country to escape tax issues. Diddy told me that was a lie. I listened, my heart pounding. The idea of an invisible hand strong enough to make people vanish and rewrite the narrative terrified me. If they truly had connections in law enforcement, in the judicial system, even in the church, who could stand against them? Diddy confessed he felt guilty for not stepping in to help these individuals. But self-preservation had taken precedence. He lived in constant fear that a misstep on his part would lead to his own demise. He recalled a time he considered going to the authorities himself. He had collected a few documents, emails, and voice recordings that hinted at the extent of corruption. It wasn't enough for a solid legal case, but it was enough to raise alarm bells. Before he could arrange a meeting with a lawyer, one of the men in suits appeared at his home. Unannounced, he casually mentioned some personal details about Diddy's family, the school his children attended, and even the time they usually left the house. Diddy took the hint. He burned the evidence. The risk was too high. At this point, I felt an urge to reassure him that God sees all, that justice would be served in time, but the words lodged in my throat. Could I honestly promise such a thing when he was describing a vast, well-protected network with no apparent chinks in its armor? I managed only a meek prayer under my breath, hoping it might offer some comfort, if not to him, then to my own troubled mind. He continued, describing how the industry was meticulously orchestrated, like a giant web where each strand connected to another. Anyone who tried to break free risked disturbing the whole structure, triggering retribution. Some, he said, were forcibly institutionalized, labeled unstable or paranoid so their claims could be dismissed. Others lost their reputations through scandal after scandal until they were discredited entirely. And then there were those who simply disappeared, never to be heard from again. I asked him if he had witnessed any of these abductions firsthand. He hesitated, then spoke of a night at a private after-party in a downtown loft. It was late, the music had died down, and most guests had gone home. A small group remained, including a rising star who had boasted earlier in the evening about having dirt on a major executive. According to Diddy, 2 men in black suits approached the star, whispered something in his ear, and led him away into a back room. A few minutes later, Diddy heard a commotion, muffled shouting, the sound of a struggle. By the time he gathered the courage to see what was happening, the star was gone. The men in suits just gave him a pointed look as if to say, "Don't ask questions." That artist was never seen in the industry again. The official story was that he left the business to pursue a different calling. He sighed heavily, as though the weight of all this guilt and fear was crushing him. He said he tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe these people really did just choose different paths, but he knew better. There were too many coincidences, too many hush-hush stories circulating among those in the know. Over time, he realized that the same power that fueled his success had a long reach, ready to eliminate any threat. I swallowed hard, feeling a knot in my stomach. The confessional began to feel like a tomb. In my years of priesthood, I had consoled those who regretted theft, adultery, even acts of violence, but this was a different magnitude entirely. The unstoppable machine he described made me feel helpless. Still, I had to ask, why now? Why risk telling me all of this when he knew the cost? He admitted he was at a breaking point. The nightmares had intensified. He sensed eyes on him everywhere, a creeping paranoia that finally drove him to seek genuine confession. He described waking in the middle of the night to find notes slipped under his door, single sentences like, "We're watching," or "Don't forget who you serve." He spoke of hearing footsteps echo outside his home when there was no one there. He believed they were closing in on him, suspecting he might turn rogue. In some twisted sense, he saw telling me as a last-ditch cry for help or redemption, or maybe just the final act of defiance before they silenced him too. I trembled, struck by a mix of horror and pity. I wanted to say something, anything to console him, but I also knew that if he was telling the truth, then my life might also be in danger. Yet, I couldn't turn him away. A priest's duty is to hear confessions, to offer the possibility of hope, no matter how dark the circumstances. The question was, could hope flourish in a situation like this? He said that some nights he thought about running, fleeing the country, changing his identity, anything to break free. But the intangible shackles of his pact still held him. The men in suits had proven they could find him wherever he went. Worse yet, he believed the presence that stalked him wouldn't let him go that easily. He felt spiritually chained, as though the entity had taken hold of his very essence. No matter where he hid, it would follow. I closed my eyes, whispering a prayer under my breath, seeking divine guidance. The line between the mundane and the demonic had never felt thinner. In that moment, my priestly training felt inadequate. I thought of exorcisms, of ancient rites to free souls from possession, but I had only read about them in texts. This was real, unfolding right before me. Would those rites even work against a pact willingly entered, a soul entangled in a web of earthly and unearthly powers? Diddy told me that sometimes, in the face of all this darkness, he felt a strange calm, as though he'd accepted his fate. But other times, panic gripped him, and he'd find himself gasping for air, imagining black-suited men at his door, or that shadowy figure in the mirrors. He was tormented by regret, by the blood on his hands, literal and figurative. He no longer believed he could be saved, yet some small spark inside him refused to give up hope. He ended by saying, "Father, if anything happens to me, if I vanish, I want someone to know it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a choice. I need at least one witness. That's you." My heart thundered in my chest as the weight of his statement sunk in. In that cramped confessional, we shared a heavy silence. Then he asked if he could continue, if I was willing to hear the final part of his confession. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I gave a solemn nod, even though he couldn't see me. The words emerged from my mouth in a shaky whisper. "I'm listening." Chapter 7. The Mark of the Beast. He hesitated before starting, as though the words themselves might summon something terrible. Finally, he spoke of the nightmares that plagued him. Nightmares so vivid they felt like previews of his own damnation. He described lying in bed, the sheets soaked with sweat, feeling unseen hands clawing at his ankles, pulling him toward the edge of the mattress. In these dreams, he would be dragged into a fiery pit, voices screaming his name in fury or torment. He couldn't tell which. Always he'd wake up just before the darkness swallowed him whole. One night, he said, he awoke with 3 deep scratches along his left arm, as though some invisible creature had raked its claws across his flesh. He'd taken a photo of it on his phone, but later deleted it out of fear, worried someone might see it and ask questions he couldn't answer. He told me he often felt a burning sensation on his chest, right above his heart, as though an invisible brand was searing his skin. These physical manifestations led him to believe he was no longer dealing with metaphorical evil. This was something tangible, something that could reach out of the shadows and leave marks on his body. He called it the mark of the beast, though he wasn't entirely sure what it meant. All he knew was that as time went on, he felt less and less like himself. It was as though a piece of his soul was siphoned away with every new success, every industry triumph. He said that sometimes he'd look in the mirror and see a flicker of something else, a face that wasn't his. It was only for a split second, but it terrified him. It had eyes that burned like embers and a twisted grin that mocked him. It was as if the entity inside him was revealing itself, taunting him with the truth. His soul was no longer his alone. I listened, horrified as he recounted a particularly awful dream. He stood in a vast chamber lit by torches, surrounded by faceless figures chanting in that same unknown language. A tall figure, cloaked in black, approached him, pressing a searing hot brand against his chest. The pain was excruciating, and he could smell his own flesh burning. When he woke up, he expected to see an actual wound, but there was nothing, only that lingering heat beneath his skin. He insisted this was no ordinary nightmare. It was a vision of his spiritual reality, a glimpse of the contract he'd signed. He spoke of how the entity seemed to feed on his fears. If he tried to resist, the nightmares grew worse. If he attempted to walk away from a lucrative deal or skip one of the freakish parties, the presence would torment him in new ways. Strange accidents, voices calling his name in empty hallways, fleeting apparitions in the corners of his vision. Eventually, he felt cornered, compelled to continue on the dark path for fear of what would happen if he dared to break free. At this point, I mustered the courage to ask, "Do you believe you can still be saved?" He paused for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not sure, Father. The closer I get to the light, the more the darkness swallows me. I can't tell if I'm looking for salvation or just acceptance that I'm doomed." The resignation in his voice broke my heart. I wanted to offer him assurances, to tell him that God's mercy is infinite, but the magnitude of his predicament, the tangible darkness entangling him, made me wonder if that mercy could be extended to a soul chained by a pact of blood. He then revealed that the final straw came when he started seeing demonic faces in everyday objects, a twisted reflection in a spoon, a monstrous outline in the condensation on a window. He believed the entity was no longer content with just haunting his studio or his dreams. It was bleeding into his daily life, asserting its claim on him. He was losing the line between reality and nightmare, as if the two were merging into one. I suggested an exorcism, though I barely knew if it would help. Exorcisms, as far as I understood them, required a willing subject and a priest capable of confronting demonic forces. This was more than simple possession. It was a contract, a union that might require more than the standard rite. Still, it was an option, and I clung to it like a lifeline. He shook his head, though I couldn't see him. I felt the motion in his words. They'd never allow that. They'd stop me before I could attempt it. "Who is they?" I asked, my voice quivering. He didn't name names, but I knew he meant the men in suits, the powerful ones behind the scenes, who might have ties even to the higher clergy. For them, it wasn't just about Diddy. It was about preserving a system that allowed them to flourish. Allowing an exorcism, a public acknowledgement of demonic influence, could pull back the veil on the entire structure. I felt a surge of desperation. "There must be some way," I whispered. He let out a hollow laugh. "I've tried everything I can think of, Father. Prayer circles, spiritual cleanses, even considered leaving everything behind, but each time the noose tightens, the nightmares worsen. The illusions become more frequent. It's as if the contract is binding itself tighter the more I struggle." He described the creeping sensation that he was nearing the end of a path. He saw himself standing on a ledge, about to make a choice, either jump into the unknown or turn back and accept his place among the damned. The nightmares hinted that the final reckoning was close. Sometimes he'd hear a voice whisper, "Your time is up," in that layered metallic tone that made his skin crawl. Other nights, the voice would say, "There's no turning back," echoing the exact line he uttered when entering the pact. He told me that despite the terror, a small part of him wanted to face the beast head-on, to tear the mask off whatever was possessing him and see if there was anything left of his soul that could be saved. But each time he gathered the courage, something would happen. A threat, a fresh wave of torment, a reminder of the unstoppable power that he served. My head spun with everything he shared. I felt torn between the role of a confessor and the role of a man who was simply afraid. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that no one is beyond redemption. But the haunting words he used, fire, hands pulling at him, his reflection turning monstrous, made me question if we were dealing with an evil so entrenched that conventional remedies might fail. Still, it is my duty to believe in the boundless mercy of God. I pressed the rosary to my lips, silently invoking the Holy Mother's intercession. Could her compassion reach a soul entangled in such a pact? I prayed it could. When I found my voice again, I reminded him that faith can move mountains, that Christ's sacrifice was meant for all sinners. He replied with a weary sigh, "I want to believe that, Father. But you haven't seen what I've seen. You haven't felt the claws digging into your spirit." He mentioned one last dream, the one that drove him to seek me out. He stood before a mirror in a grand mansion, dressed in a suit that gleamed like polished obsidian. People around him chanted his name, but their faces were contorted, their eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. In the mirror, instead of his own reflection, he saw a towering beast with horns and blackened skin, its eyes glowing red. As he stared at it, the beast placed a clawed hand against the mirror. In the dream, Diddy raised his own hand, touching the beast through the glass. The two hands merged, flesh and claw uniting. Then the reflection shattered, and he woke up screaming. He ended this chapter by admitting something that chilled me. Part of him felt relief in that dream, a sense of acceptance in meeting the beast. It terrified him, but it also felt inevitable, as though it was his destiny. He said, "Father, I just wanted someone to know before it's too late. I wanted someone to hear the truth of what I've become, of what's really out there." Then he whispered, "There's no turning back now." I sat there in the confessional, stunned into silence. The flicker of candlelight in the empty church cast strange shadows against the walls, dancing like restless spirits. My grip on the rosary was so tight it ached, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. He had one more chapter to share, he said, the final piece of his story. The dread in my heart told me it would be the worst yet. Chapter 8. The Priest's Damnation. I recall waiting in the suffocating silence of the confessional, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. He didn't speak right away, as if gathering the strength for one last confession. Eventually his voice broke the stillness, subdued and trembling. He told me he never returned after that night, that this was our only meeting. He left the church quietly, disappearing into the darkness, leaving me with the weight of his words. But that wasn't the end of the story. I wrote everything down, every detail I could remember, in my private journal that same night. My hands shook as I scribbled the words, adrenaline still coursing through me from his confession. I glanced around the empty church, every flicker of candlelight seeming to reveal a darker corner, a hidden shape. The air felt thick, oppressive. I had the unsettling sensation that someone or something was still there. The next morning I went to my superiors, certain that they had to know. My heart pounded as I recounted portions of the confession, careful not to violate the sanctity of the seal but desperate to alert them to the gravity of what was happening. They listened with stony faces, offered a few platitudes about prayer and caution, and then instructed me to let it go. I couldn't believe it. I pressed them, insisted something had to be done, a thorough inquiry, perhaps even contacting law enforcement. Their dismissive reactions were chilling. One of them, a Monsignor, simply said, "You're letting the devil's illusions frighten you. Focus on your duties." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind swirled with images of Diddy's nightmares. The bizarre rituals, the men in suits, the church leaders turning a blind eye. It felt as though I had glimpsed a hidden corridor of corruption that stretched further than I could comprehend. I had expected the church hierarchy to share my alarm, to rally against this evil. Instead, they shut me down. The seal of confession prevented me from revealing specifics, but even the generalities should have sparked some concern. Instead, I encountered only cold indifference. Strange occurrences began soon after, small things at first. My office door left ajar when I distinctly remembered locking it. Footsteps echoing in the church halls when no one else was there. Candles inexplicably snuffed out. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that my imagination was working overtime. But then more tangible signs emerged. I found an unmarked envelope slipped under my door, containing a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in bold letters: "Keep your silence." I felt a surge of dread. Whoever placed that note in my room had to have access to the rectory, which was usually locked. It dawned on me that if these men in suits had infiltrated the church hierarchy, slipping a note under a single priest's door would be child's play. Still, I tried to press on, to find someone, anyone in the institution who might listen. I reached out to an old friend from seminary, a priest who had once shown unwavering moral fortitude. He heard me out, but the next day he called to say that he'd received a polite yet menacing message from a benefactor, advising him to distance himself from my eccentric concerns. I lost hope in that route. Then came the nightmares. At first, I brushed them off as a byproduct of stress, but they bore a disturbing resemblance to the visions Diddy had described. I dreamed of the confessional booth enveloped in darkness and a figure on the other side whispering in that dual-toned voice, "You heard what you shouldn't. Now you must pay." I'd jolt awake in a cold sweat, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The following morning, I noticed 3 faint scratches on my wrist. Rationally, I told myself I might have scratched it in my sleep, but the shape of them, the sharp parallel lines, left me uneasy. As days passed, the experiences escalated. Doors in the rectory would slam shut on their own. I heard whispered conversations in empty corridors, fleeting shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. Once, during evening prayer, I saw a face reflected in the stained glass window, an ashen visage with hollow eyes. When I spun around, there was no one there. Each incident left me more unnerved, more convinced that this was a spiritual attack, a repercussion of the knowledge I now held. I tried to seek solace in prayer, spending hours kneeling before the altar, begging God for clarity, for protection. But an oppressive heaviness lingered in the church, as if some malevolent force had taken root. My superiors remained dismissive, which only deepened my isolation. I felt trapped, knowing that I couldn't reveal Diddy's confession in detail without breaking my sacred vows, yet also feeling morally compelled to do something about this evil infiltration. Then came the letter. One night, after a particularly harrowing set of visions, I returned to my room to find a crisp white envelope on my desk. Inside was a single typed page. It read, "This is your final warning. The next step is irreversible." There was no signature, no address. My hands shook as I read the words, their implication all too clear. If I continued to dig, continued to speak out, I'd face severe consequences. I thought about running too, packing a bag and leaving the diocese, maybe even leaving the country, but my conscience wouldn't let me. The vow I made as a priest bound me to serve God's people, to stand against evil even when the darkness seemed insurmountable. Besides, if Diddy had taught me anything, it was that these people, these forces, had a long reach. Where would I go that they couldn't find me? I decided to keep a journal, detailing every strange occurrence, every threatening note. I hid it carefully, telling no one of its existence. If something happened to me, at least there would be a record of what transpired. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wondered if that was my true purpose now, to leave behind some testament of the truth, just as Diddy had done when he walked into that confessional. As time wore on, I began seeing faces in the pews on Sunday, faces I recognized from the photos Diddy had shown me of missing people, industry insiders who vanished after knowing too much. I'd catch a glimpse of a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, her eyes hollow, staring at me with what looked like sorrow or perhaps warning. Then, I'd blink and she'd be gone. On another occasion, I saw a man with a scar on his cheek gazing at me from the back pew. When I looked again, the pew was empty. Were these apparitions real, or was my guilt and fear driving me to hallucinate? One particularly dreadful night, I woke to find my journal open on my bedside table. Pages turned to an entry describing the cover-up by the church's higher-ups. A black feather lay across the text, as if placed there by an unseen hand. My door was still locked from the inside. I had no explanation. Terrified, I tore the feather away and slammed the journal shut. Even now, I can't say whether it was a grim calling card or a figment of my paranoia made tangible. Still, I wrote on, determined to leave a record. I clung to my faith in small ways. Silent prayers, a flicker of hope that good ultimately triumphs over evil. But my soul felt heavier with each passing day. The confessional where Diddy had unburdened himself became an oppressive space. I found excuses to avoid it, hearing echoes of his mechanized voice whenever I walked by. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. One evening, after finishing a solitary mass, I felt a hand clamp on my shoulder in the empty sacristy. I whirled around, but no one was there. Yet the pressure on my shoulder lingered, a chilling phantom grip. I nearly collapsed in fright. Tears burned my eyes as I stumbled into the chapel, kneeling before the altar, begging God or any saint who would listen to deliver me from this. The only reply was the hollow stillness of the church. That night, I made a final entry in my journal, summarizing everything. Diddy's confession, the threats, the possible infiltration of the church. If I disappeared, I wanted the truth known. Then I sealed the journal in a waterproof bag and hid it in an old storeroom behind the church organ, praying it would remain safe. Whether it would ever see the light of day, I couldn't say. Some nights I still wake in terror, convinced that the men in suits are coming for me, or worse, that the shadowy presence that tormented Diddy has now turned its gaze on me. I question my own sanity, wondering if this is some elaborate delusion. But then I recall the note on my door, the black feather, the unshakable sense that I am being watched. As I write these last lines, I accept that my life may be forfeit. Maybe tomorrow, maybe a year from now, someone will slip under the cover of darkness and whisk me away, just like the others. But until that day comes, I remain a priest, bound by vows that won't let me keep silent. I write this testimony so that in case I vanish, the truth remains, even if I'm damned for knowing too much, for failing to save a soul entangled in a blood pact. I refuse to let fear silence me entirely. The church doors may lock, the candles may snuff out, but the truth, as horrifying as it is, must endure. And if this is my damnation, to bear witness to unspeakable evil, then so be it. My only prayer now is that someone, somewhere, will read these words and find the courage to shine a light into the darkest corners of our world, before the shadows swallow us all.